Hi, my name is Olivia and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be my TBR for the month of August, which might be slightly overambitious at 9 books. I'm headed back to university in a few weeks to finish up the final year of coursework for my degree, and the first week or two of classes is generally one of the busiest times of the semester for me. With that in mind, I fully acknowledge that I might not get a chance to get to all of these books this month, but it never hurts to be optimistic with your TBR. Jumping right into my TBR, the first book that I wanted to pick up this month was A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is the second book in A Song of Ice and Fire series, which revolves around a collection of noble houses as they're all vying for control of the throne and to control and rule over the fictional land of Westeros. I was first introduced to this series by the HBO TV show adaptation, which I started avidly watching 4 or 5 years ago, and then proceeded to find Season 8 horribly disappointing. But that's a discussion for an entirely separate video. I picked up the first book in the series, A Game of Thrones, during the month of July, and I ended up challenging myself to read it within a 24-hour period. I vlogged the entire experience, and I'll be sure to link that video up above, so you can check that out if you're interested in more of my in-depth thoughts as I went through the book. I'm the type of reader that will start to forget the names of various characters and even geographic locations if I set a book aside for any period of time. Because of this, tackling the first book within 24 hours proved to be personally very beneficial. It kept me completely immersed in the story, and I always felt like I had a very good grasp on who all of the characters were and what they were doing at any given time. I also wasn't reading any other books at the time, which could have distracted me, so that probably also helped. All in all, this was a win-win situation for me, so I'm going to go and try to keep this challenge going with reading A Clash of Kings in 24 hours as well. I'm not sure that I'll be able to finish this one in as short of a time period. It is about 160 pages longer than the first book, but I'm going to vlog my entire reading experience regardless of whether I fail miserably or actually end up accomplishing the goal. I'm very excited to continue on with this series, re-immerse myself in Martin's writing and world building, and get a chance to become reacquainted with some of the characters that I fell in love with in the first book. I've heard that the TV show, as you get further and further through the seasons, begins to deviate more and more from Martin's books. So it'll be interesting to see how accurately the second book is portrayed in the show. Next up is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, which is the first book in a young adult series that's wildly popular here on BookTube. The novel's protagonist is an 18-year-old assassin named Selena, who's released from imprisonment in exchange for her participation in a competition to identify the next royal assassin. Winning the tournament would require Selena to serve the crown for a period of 4 years, after which she would then be granted her freedom. When other contestants begin dying under mysterious circumstances, Selena takes it on herself to investigate these occurrences, and the book unfolds from there. This series certainly has its collection of die-hard fans, but these are also accompanied with some very severe critics who have quite a few things to say about the series. Many of the reviews that I've read and watched touch on a collection of the same concerning and inconsistent aspects of this book, and these have me apprehensive going into the series, which probably isn't the best way to approach it. This first book was also originally published back in 2012, which was starting to become the height of the dystopian young adult books, and many of the same tropes and themes were beginning to emerge within the genre. When the market became overly saturated with these, I began to resent many of these tropes, and they immediately jump out to me as huge red flags and negatives while I'm reading. Consequently, I'm desperately hoping that this book doesn't read like a YA that was published back in 2012. With respect to Maas's other works, I did read the Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy in its entirety, and while it did have its issues, I found it overall to be an enjoyable, quick read, and I finished all of the books within a matter of days. Ultimately, I'm hoping that I can say the same about this series, even if it is a little bit lengthier. Moving on, Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo is the next book on my TBR for the month of August. The plot summary for this one had me at the mention of a heist, and that's about all I know prior to picking this book up. I've heard that it's best to go into this series completely blind, with very minimal knowledge, if any at all. And I've been trying to stick to this, even though I keep hearing about it constantly on Goodreads and BookTube. From what I understand, this series was originally meant to be a duology. I haven't read many duologies to date, and I'm not quite sure what to expect with respect to the plot structure, the narrative itself, whether or not there are going to be cliffhangers, and the overall pacing throughout each of these first two books. I think it's interesting that Bardugo initially opted to go for a duology instead of the more traditional trilogy setup, but has now changed her mind and has decided to add a third book that's set many years in the future, in the author's own words. I haven't had the best track record with books that are somewhat haphazardly tacked onto series, especially series that were previously deemed complete by the authors. Consequently, I'm a little bit hesitant to continue picking up these kinds of books, especially in YA series. Although, considering the third book doesn't yet have a title or a publication date, I think I may be a little bit too early to be worried about this, and I have quite some time to figure out whether I want to pick up this last installment. Overall, I have a feeling that this first book is going to be an adventurous, fast-paced, and exciting read, as well as one with a very unique setup. I'm hopeful that it'll live up to all of its hype, and that this hasn't set me up for some disappointment down the line. Next up is Scythe by Neal Shusterman, which was actually part of my July TBR, but since I didn't have a chance to pick it up last month, I figured I would tackle it in August. Scythe also falls under the YA genre, and it's set in a society that has completely eliminated hunger, disease, and even death itself. In order to control population growth, Scythes have been appointed to end the lives of various individuals within this world. The novel follows two protagonists who are apprenticed to a scythe, which sounds like a fascinating and extremely creative premise. I haven't read any Neal Shusterman books to date, and I also haven't been reading many YA books or YA series recently. I think this book may be the perfect way to ease back into the genre, and that's something that I'm looking to do throughout the month of August. Based on the plot summary and some of the reviews that I've heard, I'm optimistic that this one will avoid some of my least favorite tropes, and instead will present an unusual and somewhat unconventional tale. Next up is A Pleasure and a Calling by Phil Hogan, which is classified as an adult psychological thriller. The main character, William Hemming, is a real estate agent who keeps a key to every house that he's ever sold. After the new owners have moved in, he lets himself into their residences, snooping through their belongings and personal items, and uncovering a few secrets along the way. From what I understand, this book starts off when a dead body is found in the garden, and it unfolds from there. I was first introduced to this book here on BookTube, and I'm very surprised at how infrequently it's mentioned on the platform, as well as the relatively low number of ratings that it has on Goodreads. As of the time that I'm filming this review, it has just over 3,700 ratings and about 650 reviews. I'm not really sure why this is, particularly because the premise sounds so original, compelling, and downright creepy. I'm wondering if it just hasn't received the publicity that it's deserved to date, and I'm curious to see whether the number of ratings correlates to how good or bad a book is. Nevertheless, I'm very excited to delve into this one. It's fairly short for a thriller at just under 300 pages, but I'm hoping that this will translate to a very fast-paced read that'll keep me on the edge of my seat the entire time. The next book on my list is My Lovely Wife by Samantha Downing. This is another psychological thriller that follows Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a couple who have decided to spice up their otherwise mundane and boring marriage by murdering people. I don't know much more above and beyond that because I'm trying to go into this book with little to no knowledge about the plot beforehand. With the minimal information that I do know, which isn't much to go on, I could see the plot going in many different directions, and I'm curious to see which one the author opted for. I'm not sure where it's ultimately going to end up, and I could foresee it falling into a few of the stereotypes and pitfalls that have become a little too common within the thriller genre. I'm desperately hoping that it doesn't go down any of these paths, and if it chooses not to, I think it could have quite a bit of potential. The premise itself sounds creative, and I think it might be a refreshing change from the slew of domestic thrillers that I've been reading recently. There's been so much hype surrounding this novel on BookTube within the past several weeks and months, and it's been very well received by thriller aficionados, as well as those who don't often read the genre. Moving on, I also wanted to mention Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, which is a thriller written by the same author who penned Gone Girl. The book centers on Libby Day, whose mother and sisters were brutally murdered during her childhood. Throughout the ensuing investigation and court case, Libby testifies against her brother Ben, claiming that he was the one who committed the murders. The novel itself is set 25 years after the crime and her brother's conviction for his involvement in the murders, and it starts off when Libby is approached by the Kill Club. Members of the society are fascinated by true crime, and they're determined to come to their own conclusions about some of the most notorious cases that have marked the country during their lifetimes. In exchange for monetary gain, Libby agrees to work alongside the Kill Club, returning to her hometown, reconnecting with individuals from her past, and reliving the night that her mother and her sisters were murdered. Gone Girl was a 4-star read for me, and it was the first book that introduced me to the psychological thriller genre, and made me think that it was something that I might be interested in further pursuing. Now, I can say that the thriller genre is one of my favorites, and most of my reads throughout the year come from that genre. Gone Girl is the only book of Gillian Flynn's that I've read so far, and I was determined to change that throughout the course of 2019. Needless to say, I have very high hopes and expectations for this one, and I desperately hope that it doesn't disappoint and can live up to Gone Girl. Next up is Wolfhunter River by Rachel Caine, which is the third book in the Stillhouse Lake trilogy. This is a psychological thriller series who follows Gina Royal, who's a wife and mother at the start of the first book. For most of her marriage, the garage at the family's home has been completely off limits to Gina, and as far as she knew, it served as her husband's workshop. At the start of Stillhouse Lake, she's completely blindsided when a car crashes into the garage and reveals that inside, her serial killer husband has been keeping his lair, where he tortures and kills his victims. After his conviction and imprisonment, Gina takes her children and moves from place to place throughout the country, constantly changing their identities in an attempt to escape both her husband, who has sent her threatening letters and messages, as well as the unrelenting public, who think that she played some role in her husband's murders. The first book in the series was a 5-star read for me, and the second book earned a 4-star rating. So I'm excited to see what this third book has in store, and how it's going to tie up all of the loose ends that were introduced earlier on in the series. I'm generally not a huge fan of the middle books in trilogies, which may explain the 4-star rating, and I'm hoping it means that this will be another 5-star read for me. The second book in the series left off on quite a cliffhanger, so this book has been long awaited, and I'm excited to see what's in store for all of my favorite characters. The 9th and final book that I wanted to read during the month of July is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a classic that's recounted from the perspective of a British lawyer who's recounting some of the odd and strange experiences he's had with his close friend and scientist, Dr. Jekyll. During a presumed experiment gone wrong, Dr. Jekyll unleashes a dark, monstrous, and even murderous side to himself that he refers to as Mr. Hyde. This is one of the darkest premises that I've come across for a classic by far, and I'm intrigued to see if this book is going to dabble at all in the thriller and the horror genres. I'm also not sure whether I should be expecting heaps of symbolism and a very lyrical writing style with this one, both of which I've come to associate with classics throughout my experiences in both college and high school English courses. Or, on the flip side, I can't tell if this is going to be more of a creepy, disturbing, and plot-driven tale that doesn't spend much time focusing on the symbolism or the writing in particular. It's a fairly short book, especially for a classic, at only a little over 200 pages, so it'll be interesting to see how Stevenson decided to structure and pace the novel. I think I can safely say that I'm headed into this book with absolutely no expectations. It's incredibly different from any other classic that I've read to date, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it may take a little getting used to at the start. And that concludes my August TBR. Let me know in the comments down below what books you're planning to read this month, and I'll see you in my next video.